A sense of alarm is building among officials at the Justice Department and the FBI who are bracing for possible revenge prosecutions from the incoming Trump administration. NBC News reports that some civil servants who work on a government salary have proactively reached out to lawyers. That's according to 3 people with knowledge of their deliberations. They're worried about the effect of long and costly legal battles. Joining me here in studio, NBC News senior executive editor for national security, David Rohde, who reported this story. Also with us, Glenn Kirshner, a former federal prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst. It's good to have you here, David. A lot of DOJ staffers we had been hearing and you had been reporting were saying there was some nervousness about what might happen, about, frankly, what has been said about the plans for going after people who they felt unfairly went after them. But how has the choice of Matt Gaetz changed the equation, or has it?
It has, and that's the difference. There was worry about congressional investigations. They expected that. But the choice of Gaetz, which was, I think, a real surprise to many people inside the DOJ, signaled everywhere, yes, that he's a lawyer, but he's had no experience prosecuting cases. But most of all, he is a firebrand loyalist, a very vocal supporter of President Trump. And it's seen by people as a choice. It's someone who Trump trusts, and someone who, given the ethics investigation, sort of owes Trump. Trump is sort of protecting him by giving him this new job just before the ethics report comes out. So it has raised fears that there could actually be criminal investigations and prosecutions by the Trump administration of career DOJ and FBI officials.
How would you quantify, or can you quantify, the level of concern right now?
I think it's limited. People are worried about maybe in long investigations. A likely scenario is a special counsel is appointed who will look at all these investigations that could go on for years. People are not worried about actually somehow being convicted and sent to jail. They are adamant. One FBI official former FBI officials said, we did everything above board, but this is a different world, and that you have to prepare for something like this. To be convicted, Trump can order the attorney general to investigate people. That's possible because of the Supreme Court's immunity ruling this spring. But to be convicted, you need a judge to sign off that there is probable cause of guilt. And most importantly, you need a jury to convict. So there's not real fear of going to jail. It's more long, costly legal battles.
Yeah, I mean, Glenn, again, they believe their work has been above board, as he said, leaving them in many cases just baffled about what criminal charges could even be brought against them. What kind of case could a Trump loyalist be able to bring, or at least thinking about bringing?
A vindictive case, a frivolous case, a case that is not supported by any evidence of which we are aware. Chris, we saw a preview of this in the first Trump administration when John Durham was appointed special counsel to do what? Investigate the investigators who investigated Donald Trump. And what do we know? That investigation produced 2 trials. Both trials were just soundly rejected by the jury with not guilty verdicts, prompt not guilty verdicts. And when you have a candidate like Donald Trump make a pledge that he will be your retribution, this feels like it could be Donald Trump's revenge tour. So just the fact of lengthy investigations and prosecutions, even if they are vindictive and they are promptly dismissed by the federal bench, it's still going to take a toll on people. So I do believe, Chris, that the federal judiciary, the trial court judges in Washington, D.C., where most of these investigations will be run and cases brought, if any, the federal judiciary will stand as a bulwark against frivolous and vindictive prosecutions. But that doesn't mean people won't suffer if they are put through having to defend against a frivolous prosecution.
And we've heard from enough people who have talked about what it is, David, when someone brings a lawsuit, a frivolous lawsuit. I mean, obviously, there is a cost, right? Even going and consulting with a lawyer may incur a cost. If it actually came to the point where there were charges against them, that goes up exponentially. Pensions potentially could be at stake. And then the emotional cost and the fear that many people have expressed, not just for themselves, but for their families.
So in the first term, Andrew McCabe, he was the deputy director of the FBI, his pension was revoked. He's, I think, subsequently won. But that was a real shot across the bow to a lot of these civil servants who don't make that much money. FBI agents have to work 20 years before they can get any kind of pension. So the worst case scenario here is that you're essentially deterring. It's a sign to people, do not investigate Donald Trump. If you do, you'll pay a heavy cost for it. I saw some of this already in the Mar-a-Lago investigation. No one wanted to work on that case. They all sort of hoped that Trump would turn the documents back into the government, but he didn't, because they saw it as a lose-lose case, that it's going to derail your career. And this is a dangerous thing, because you should have people who want, when there's a legitimate investigation, you need FBI agents and prosecutors who will carry it out.
Yeah. So Glenn, Politico spoke to an attorney who represents some Trump critics afraid of becoming targets of retribution. His advice, take a vacation overseas around the inauguration. I mean, but what does that tell us about, seriously, how people are looking at this? And I think a lot of that does speak to, right, the emotional toll or the fear that some people have in not knowing what might happen.
Chris, the good men and women of law enforcement who are given an assignment and directed to investigate possible crime where there's adequate predication, enough evidence to open that criminal investigation, should not later find themselves retaliated against or, being advised to flee the country to protect themselves. I mean, that is so corrosive to good government. And, but when you have Donald Trump not only saying he'll be your retribution, but pledging multiple times he'll even use the military to go after his political opponents, it feels like an unconstrained Donald Trump can really do a lot of damage to the institutions that he will sit atop.
One of the biggest positions yet to be named is Treasury Secretary. And now the New York Times is reporting Donald Trump is having second thoughts about his top choices. So who are the men Donald Trump is rethinking, and who is he considering now? Joining us, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans and Bloomberg Business Week national correspondent Joshua Green. Green is the author of The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the struggle for a new American politics. Christine, I'm going to start with you on who could lead Treasury. He's got four names: Kevin Warsh, Mark Warren, Howard Lutnick, and Scott Bessent. What's the difference between these men?
Some are more traditional, would be a more traditional steward of the Treasury Department. The Cantor Fitzgerald, Howard Lutnick, who you mentioned there, is kind of a real type A personality, sort of more out there. He's been really behind Donald Trump over the past few weeks, so he's more of that sort of cheerleader kind of figure you've seen. Look, this position, I think the most important, only Donald Trump knows who he's going to pick.
Who's who when we're looking at these pictures?
Okay, Howard Lutnick there is on the left, and you've got a couple of investors that you're seeing. There's Howard Lutnick on the left again. So the most
on the right,
the most important thing here is this position. This is America's diplomat for the world in terms of finance. We are the biggest investment in the world, so this person has to execute Donald Trump's strategy, but not upset the apple cart in terms of our destination for all of that investment around the world.
You're talking about, Donald Trump has these big aims here. He wants to impose sweeping new tariffs, and he also wants to get rid of millions of undocumented immigrants, two things that could potentially be very disruptive.
And he told Americans he was going to lower their prices, but the policies he is also saying he's going to do are almost by every economist seen as inflationary. So he's got a tall order here, and he's got to have a Treasury Secretary who can be the person who executes it.
So, Josh, you've been writing about that tall order. You call it an impossible task, which is delivering for both the working class and the billionaire class. What are these promises that Donald Trump has made to each of these groups, and how do you do both at the same time?
Yeah, it's a great question, Katie. And I write in the new issue of Business Week that the central tension in Trump's presidency is really going to be managing this coalition, which on the one hand includes billionaires and Wall Street figures like Elon Musk and Howard Lutnick, but on the other hand includes this multiracial working class coalition that a lot of people didn't think would turn out for Trump, but did. And as I say in the piece, there are a number of auspicious signs. First of all, Trump has signaled that the first thing he wants to do, and Mike Johnson, the Republican House Speaker, has signaled the first thing he wants to do is extend Trump's tax cuts for corporations and the rich. Trump told me and some of my Business Week colleagues in July he'd actually like to cut corporate tax rates even further. So it's probably not the kinds of things that working class folks were hoping for when they elected Donald Trump. So on the one hand, he has to keep that Wall Street contingent happy. On the other hand, as Christine said, he's promised to lower prices. And if you go out and push through deep tax cuts and you raise tariffs, most mainstream economists, not Trump, but most mainstream economists think those price increases are going to be passed along to consumers. So I think he's got a really tough task ahead of him. And that's not even beginning with the problem at hand, which is that he can't seem to settle on a Treasury Secretary.
He's also got to get a little bit of a buy-in from Congress on some of the other things that he wants to do, not to mention the tax cuts, but the child tax credit that he's proposed from $2,000 right now to $5,000. He's talking about eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits. Also talking about eliminating taxes on tips. All of this stuff would cut into the baseline finances of this country. We've been so worried about the national debt. What do you do when Donald Trump comes along and starts promising everybody free money?
Well, that's a real problem that Trump has. I mean, we did a study at Bloomberg that tallied up all of his proposed tax cuts, and I think it came to something like over $10 trillion. So there is no way, even with full Republican control of Washington, he could deliver even a majority of that. So he's got a problem ahead of him as far as figuring out how to satisfy all these pieces of his coalition. But the other thing that Trump cares about, let's be honest, is the stock market.
Yeah.
He prides himself on market record highs. And there's been some nervousness over the last week or so. We've seen stocks fall because people don't really know whether to take him at his word. Investors do, whether he's going to push high taxes. They don't know who he's going to put at the Treasury. There's a lot of worry among people I've spoken to that we could wind up with a Treasury Secretary who's sort of the equivalent of Matt Gaetz, somebody who's viewed as an extremist, far off the Wall Street map. So until these issues and positions start to get filled and we get some clarity on this, I think there's going to be a lot of nervousness from everyone about exactly what a second Trump administration is going to look like.
I'm so glad you went there, because I wonder if the stock market is going to be the limiting factor for Donald Trump and who he chooses for Treasury Secretary and what he actually follows through with, whether he follows through with the tariffs, for instance, if it does, or the mass deportations. If it does start to negatively impact the stock market, does Donald Trump pull back?
He uses the stock market as his personal grade, letter grade for how he's doing, and he takes personal credit for it. So I think that actually could be a mitigating factor for him as he gets out there and he's actually putting these policies in place. And what he says about, somebody who's a Wall Street, mainstream kind of player, that it would be devastating for Donald Trump to put a flamethrower in the Treasury Department. I don't think he wants a flamethrower in the Treasury Department. I think he really wants somebody who's going to do tax reform next year, get the tax cuts that he wants, and is going to be his steward on the national stage as he tries to explain to the world why he's putting all these tariffs in.
Josh, it's been so long since I've seen you. I will give you the final word in the program.
Yeah, look, it's a really tough job because everybody around Trump has told me he wants a Treasury Secretary who looks the part, meaning rich, strong, alpha male, et cetera, and beloved by Wall Street. On the other hand, he's trying to do things like raise tariffs that people on Wall Street don't want to happen. And so it's a really tough job to fill, and nobody has really popped up who's acceptable and willing to do the job. And so we're in the middle of this kind of disarray, and it's something Trump's going to have to figure out.
It's interesting it's taken this long to get a Treasury Secretary nomination from Donald Trump or a pick. We've gotten all the other big ones pretty quickly. Joshua, it hasn't even been that long. It's been 2 weeks. Joshua Green, really good to see you. Thanks for coming on. Christine Romans, thank you as well.
What is vetting, really, right? What is vetting? Why do they do that? The whole reason nominees for high office get checked out, the whole reason they get vetted, the whole reason there's supposed to be a deep dive background check on anyone applying for a security clearance, anybody potentially being appointed to high office, the whole reason to do that is to make sure there isn't going to be any leverage against them or any hidden dynamics at play while they have a sensitive position on behalf of the United States of America. So you want to know, is this person a foreign agent? Or were they a foreign agent in the past? Are they linked to organized crime? Do they have a criminal background of any kind or links to criminal associates? Is this person on someone's payroll or in debt to someone? Are they addicted to drugs or alcohol or gambling? Is there anything about this person's life or background that makes them potentially vulnerable to blackmail or extortion? Is there anything that can be known about them that they really wouldn't want to get out and they might do anything to keep it from being made public? Well, how about if a guy got his job only because the contents of an official government report into his alleged child sex trafficking was politically suppressed, and he's therefore desperate to keep that hidden from the public? While, among many other people involved in the process, at least 10 members of Congress have that report that he is desperate to keep hidden. Is that a good situation for the Attorney General of the United States to be in? This election, it turns out, was close. Closer than the rhetoric and the noise around it would make you think. Donald Trump only improved on his electoral vote showing from 2016 by 6 EVs. He got 6 more electoral votes than he got in his razor-thin win in 2016. He went from 306 to 312. In 2016, at least in all the states he won, the Republican Senate candidate won as well. In this election, that did not happen. There were 4 states where Trump won, but the Republican Senate candidate lost. So his coattails were pretty short, pretty thin. Republicans in the House will still have only a teeny tiny majority, one of the smallest majorities in history. The popular vote still to this day continues to get tallied up. It looks like Trump will end up being below 50% of the popular vote, which means most of the people who came out and voted in this election voted for someone else, not Trump. So he won, yeah. But it's a narrow win. Here's how the New York Times put it. Quote, Trump secured his victory by just a cumulative 237,000 votes in 3 states that, had they gone the other way, would have meant victory for Harris. So it was a narrow win for Trump, but it was a win. And in addition to holding on to their tiny majority in the House next year, Republicans will also take control of the Senate next year. But that's next year. And that means for Democrats, right now, right this very minute, this is an important time when they should be making the most of every second they continue to control the Senate. And in the weird circumstances we're in right now, that could mean telling the FBI to hand over their file on the federal criminal investigation into Matt Gaetz. Hand that over to the Senate. It could mean trying to subpoena the Ethics Committee report from the House if they refuse to release it. It could mean that the Senate gets testimony themselves from the witnesses who testified about Matt Gaetz to the House Ethics Committee. None of these things are normal to happen in a transition, but I say this, right? I mean, under normal circumstances, all those things I just described, those would all happen while confirmation hearings were underway for Trump's appointees, right? Or they're things that you could be assured would happen when the FBI did background checks on people for the confirmation process or for security clearances or whatever, right? With this new administration coming in, though, they don't want to do background checks. They reportedly are not doing background checks for their potential nominees. And of course, they don't want confirmation hearings of any kind either. The president-elect, Donald Trump, is demanding that the Senate should go into recess so he can install anyone he wants in any job with no vetting by anyone, no confirmation process, no hearings, no vote. So Democrats are in a really interesting position, right? With that demand by Trump on the table, demanding that there just be recess appointments only, no confirmations. With that demand on the table, there's no reason for Democrats in the Senate to wait, right? It's possible no confirmation hearings are ever coming for any of these nominees. So if there is something the American people should know about any of these people who Trump says are going to be his nominees running the government, well, now might be the only chance to do it. While Senate Democrats still have the gavel and can still use that power, including subpoena power, to do what might be the only vetting any of these nominees will ever get. Senator Blumenthal today saying that for the Senate Armed Services Committee, that might include holding a hearing to get testimony from witnesses who say they have information about the rape allegation against Donald Trump's choice for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Fox News host Pete Hegseth denies that he sexually assaulted or raped anybody, but he now admits paying a woman to stay silent about her rape allegation against him. You should note that California authorities never brought charges against him when they investigated that matter, but we're going to be speaking with a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee about that possibility, about that nomination and more coming up here live in just a moment. I do think it's worth being very clear-eyed, very realistic about what's going on here and what options people have right now in this moment. Obviously, I think it seems clear to the Democrats that they ought to spend this time while they are still in control of the Senate, confirming as many federal judges as possible. They are working on that. They confirmed another federal appeals court judge just tonight, so that's something. But there are literally dozens of Biden judicial nominees still pending, and there's no reason the Democrats in the Senate cannot work around the clock and through every second of the time they've got left to confirm every one of those pending Biden judicial nominations. That seems like a very obvious point and a good way to spend their time. What is maybe the less obvious point, though, is that the Congress, the whole U.S. Capitol, right? Both houses of Congress, they're really in a fight for their existence at this moment. Whether they know it or not, whichever party they're in, whatever lovely relationship they think they have on a personal level with Donald Trump, the project of someone who is authoritarian-minded when they get into power is to consolidate all power in themselves, which means taking it away from everyone else, right? And there's been a lot of talk about how Trump is doing that within the executive branch, taking away the independence of any agency, any department, anything that we think of as the federal government, including law enforcement, right? That's been discussed a lot. Trump consolidating power within the executive branch. There has been less talk about how Trump is also trying to consolidate all the other power of the government as well, namely, and especially, the power that Congress has. Under the Constitution, the Senate has the right and responsibility to confirm nominees to important jobs in the government. Not just the cabinet. It's more than 1,000 positions that are supposed to be Senate confirmed. Trump has publicly told the Senate that for his next term, he demands that they stop doing that. He has told them explicitly that they must recess, shut themselves down, because he wants them to have no say in who he puts in office, no matter what the Constitution says. That's why the Democrats who are in control in the Senate right now, they may have the only opportunity they may have the only chance the public's going to have to hold hearings on and investigate and vet and tell the public what the public needs to know about these nominees. It is weird to try to do this in the transition before the nominations are formally made by the newly sworn in president, but honestly, that'll be too late. Trump is the one who made it weird by making this demand that the Senate not confirm any of his appointees. Democrats should take him at his word and do the hearings now. But it's not just the Senate. The Washington Post was first to report that these guys are also planning to try to kibosh the other major role that Congress has in governing the United States, which is the power of the purse, right? The money, appropriating the funds that the government spends. Washington Post reports that part of the plan for Trump's radical austerity program that he has outsourced to eccentric right-wing billionaire Elon Musk, part of the plan is that they're not going to have Musk and his commission, whatever it is, they're not going to have them make a proposal to Congress as to what Elon Musk thinks ought to be cut out of the government. They're just planning on cutting it all directly, having Musk just tell Trump what to do, and then having Trump just make the cuts himself, leaving Congress out of it, getting rid of, in other words, the power of the purse. So it's just decided between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And this isn't small stuff, right? This is putting the accused child sex trafficking guy who says he wants to abolish the FBI and maybe the whole Justice Department in charge of the Justice Department without any vetting or confirmation hearing or background check or vote. This is, according to the guy who is heading up the austerity program with Elon Musk, a plan to, quote, delete the government, which is the exact same language used by the influential radical blogger who J.D. Vance cites as a major influence on his thinking. This guy, Curtis Yarvin, is the one who started this thing on the far right, that the government needs to be, quote, deleted. He says the government needs to be deleted, and then we need to replace it with something new, something for which he says we will, quote, need to get over our dictator phobia. We need to delete the government and then get over our dictator phobia. They're not trying to abolish the fundamental functions of Congress. They're not trying to get rid of Article 1 of the Constitution to do small stuff. They're trying to get rid of Article 1 of the Constitution. They're trying to marginalize and disempower the whole Congress in order to do the most radical things imaginable. And you know what? Nobody loves Congress. but you'll love it a lot compared to the alternative when it's gone. Because I, for one, have plenty of dictator phobia. I think that's a healthy phobia to have, and I have no plans to get over it my whole life. Nobody knows if the Republicans in Congress will fight to keep our structure of government, whether they will roll over and let Trump, say, for a start, get rid of the Senate's role in voting on nominations, whether they will just roll over and let Trump take over the power of the purse and start directly controlling all spending. But that's what Trump is trying to do. And right now, for these next few weeks before he's in power, it's actually in Democrats' power. It is in Democrats' hands in the Senate to show what the Congress can do, to show what it's for, to do the job, and to make it as hard as possible for them to get away with the worst things they are trying to do even before they take over. That's doable, and that is something that is doable right now.
Joining us now is retired four-star General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. General, it's great seeing you. I thank you for your time. What do you make of this decision to allow Ukraine to use these U.S.-provided long-range weapons to strike inside Russia?
I think it's a political move by the United States to respond to aggression, escalation by Putin. I think the military effects, every additional weapon system helps, but it's too little, too late to have any decisive impact on the outcome of the fight. Maybe it will help Ukraine hold on to Kursk, but I see it as primarily a political gesture. Remember, Jose, that in addition to sort of announcing this, the Pentagon actually has to approve each target because they have to provide the specific targeting information in a certain format to feed into the ATACMS missile. So this is, as Kelly said, this is far from being a sort of let's have at 'em decision. This is a very restrained decision, has a certain political message.
And what is that message? Because it's a political gesture, political message, you're saying, General. What is that message when we're really just 2 months, a little bit over 2 months before a new administration comes in?
I think it's a message that says we're going to continue to look at providing more resources to keep Ukraine in this fight, following the policy decisions of the Biden administration, which is don't get into a confrontation with Russia, but don't let Ukraine lose. So it's a continuation of the same policy. And Jose, the problem with the policy, just to be very, very clear, is wars don't work that way. In war, you need escalation dominance. We gave up on that. In war, you need to concentrate resources, go after decisive objectives. We're not enabling the Ukrainians to do that. So really, this thing is stalled out right now and has been stalled out as a deliberate policy of the Biden administration. The result is, as some of my Ukrainian colleagues and friends told me when I was in New York a few weeks ago, 50,000 Ukrainian young people now need prosthetics. It's that bad. And each one of these Ukrainians typically goes through not just one amputation, but 2 or 3 amputations because the battlefield care is so poor. So this is an extremely costly policy that we followed for Ukraine. It has not led Ukraine to victory, but it has prevented defeat.
And that stalemate policy is completely diametrically opposed to how Russia has been carrying this invasion out. I mean, Bloomberg now reporting that North Korea may deploy as many as 100,000 troops to help Russia in its war with Ukraine if the alliance between the two countries continues to deepen. I mean, this, General, is something that Russia has not been limiting their efforts.
Well, that's true. I mean, Russia went in first with a mistaken plan, thinking they could seize it with an intelligence-type operation and get rid of Zelensky. When that failed, their military just wasn't capable, even though it had superior forces, of creating decisive operations. And so they've gone at this grinding offensive. But this is characteristic of the Russian military, I have to say, Jose. They've never really understood the training and skills required at the bottom of the military organization to be effective. They continue these meat grinder attacks. That's characteristic of Russian style going back into World War II. And While they haven't used nuclear weapons, they're using a lot of other things that we don't typically hear about, like chemical weapons. They're using thermobarics. They're attacking civilian infrastructure. It's all against international law. And under the United Nations Charter, every nation should come in to help Ukraine defend and regain its territory.
Meanwhile, General, NBC News has exclusive reporting that the Trump transition team is compiling a list of current and former senior U.S. military officers who were involved in the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and exploring whether they could be court-martialed for their involvement. This is all according to a U.S. official and a person familiar with the plan. What do you make of that, General?
Well, I think it's, first of all, I think it's politically the wrong thing to do. I don't think that that should be done. I don't think you can go back and get people later. But let's say it goes forward. I think if you really look at the evidence, you're going to find that two things. Number one is the conditions for the disastrous withdrawal were set actually by the Trump administration and by the president himself when he executed that plan and ignored the Afghans and so forth. But I think you're going to also find that the generals in the effort were under political instructions by the Biden administration to get out as soon as possible, no matter what. And I think when you look at that, you're going to find that maybe there were mistakes somewhere, but they basically did what they were told to do.
Yeah, and General, finally, just, thinking of this extraordinary experience that you have and your knowledge of history, when you were talking about the UN and its role and importance in, for example, in issues like what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. But I'm taken back to when I visited the killing fields just outside Srebrenica and what was going on there, where the blue helmets were in Srebrenica and did nothing. How do you, General, bring in these organizations that have charters that in critical times don't do anything?
The United Nations is useful in some circumstances, Jose, but without strong backing from the United States, it's not useful in the most difficult circumstances. It didn't work in Bosnia, and we had to put NATO in there. But if you look at it today in Haiti, if you look at what's going on in Haiti, where the United States is now calling for a UN force to go into Haiti, again, without U.S. leadership, without U.S. technology, the ability to actually go after the gangs and so forth, that United Nations force is not going to be very effective in Haiti.
All right, Mark, millions of people voted for Donald Trump and his mass deportation plan. Now it appears that he fully intends to carry this out with the military doing this work. Are we ready for this?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I don't know if the government is ready for it. I mean, the execution of something like this, I mean, whether the military is involved or not is a spectacular logistical challenge. I mean, even maybe 500,000 would be, I mean, let alone 10 million or whatever numbers we're talking. We're talking chaos. We're talking massive disruption. My guess is that Trump at some point will probably just focus on a few symbolic things like, some wall building, a few high profile cases, and maybe sort of say, look, this is all getting done, cook the numbers a little bit and say, yeah, this is happening. But no, I mean, this is chaos of orders of magnitude more than we've ever seen.
Carol, specifically on the military aspect, to kind of the point Mark was just making, how likely is it that he's going to be able to clear all the legal hurdles that are going to make this thing happen? Because the scale is massive.
I think it's absolutely right that the scale is going to be a big worry. And I'm with Mark on the idea that Trump will want to have some bold symbolic gestures. But even if we're talking a few thousand people, it's going to be massive. And then you're going to have a series of organizations, rightly, in many cases, filing legal challenges, questioning the appropriateness of, for example, separation of families, which is not a legal matter at our border. We aren't allowed to separate families. You may remember in the last administration, Donald Trump told his DHS secretary and other border security officials that he would just pardon them, just separate the kids from the families, and I'll pardon you later if it turns out to be a crime. I do think one thing you're going to find here is that all sorts of different networks of military officials are going to question the legality of them being enlisted in this mission. And that will be also very interesting. Who stands up and says, I'm sorry, my organization is not going to be able to be commandeered for this purpose?
All right, well, then let's talk money, because Donald Trump told NBC News that there was no price tag on this plan. Now, one immigrant rights group said this could cost about $90 billion a year. And we've talked about this before. It would lower GDP. It would severely affect industries that desperately need workers. We have over 7 million open jobs in this country right now. Leanne, do people realize the real world impact, the economic impact this is going to have on our government and our economy?
No, absolutely not. That is not something that was talked about on the campaign trail when Donald Trump campaigned heavily and primarily on deporting undocumented immigrants. This was central to reasons why he got elected or reelected. Talking to voters across the country, this is the issue of immigration is something that people mentioned. Tough border security is what they say they liked about Donald Trump, and a weak border, something that they didn't like about President Biden. And Kamala Harris was unable to separate herself from that. But the economic impact could absolutely be massive when all of a sudden there's entire plants or factories in towns that are completely void of workers. And the business owners are wondering how they're going to get the work done because the workers aren't going to be there, Steph.
All right. I always want to talk about economics. So let's talk about the Treasury Secretary pick, because up until now, it has been Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick. Scott Bessent, who has a long history in finance, a well-known investor. He kind of got poo-pooed last week. It was Howard Lutnick's camp trashing him because years ago, Scott Bessent worked for George Soros. But the thing is, if you want to hire basically, and I'm not saying he should hire a Wall Street titan, but if you want to hire a big guy from Wall Street, chances are over the last 30 years, they worked for Julian Robertson, Michael Milken, or George Soros. But of course, just the Soros affiliation has gotten Trump somewhat soured on Scott Bessent. Now, Howard Lutnick is a super slick sales guy, but definitely doesn't have the economics pedigree that Bessent does. But Elon Musk backed him this weekend. He's a guy who can shake things up. But the Wall Street Journal put it out today. The Treasury Secretary is the one place that we don't need a shakeup. We need to stay the course, right? We need to make sure the bond market that's starting to get panicked doesn't panic. And then suddenly today we hear a few new names, Mark Rowan, who's the chairman of Apollo. And my phone was legitimately on fire this morning from 15 different people like, yes, Mark Rowan, kind of showing that that investors on Wall Street don't want it to be a Howard Lutnick. They want it to be a Rowan, if not Scott Bessent. What are you hearing?
Well, usually, there is an establishment preference for the safer pick, right? Especially in the financial market. Scott Bessent would probably be seen as a safer pick. I think in this case, Trump does almost by definition want to shake this up. I think the success, he almost doesn't want to acknowledge that there has been a successful economy under the Biden administration and the Treasury is in a good place right now. He would actually like to, and well, first of all, also trade is going to be central to this. And he is going to need someone who is extremely supportive of his tariff ideas, no matter what direction that goes in. So this is more of a traditional kind of, kind of a beauty pageant kind of Trump pick, whereas these others are more brute force, sort of will to sort of, look, you must vote for Matt Gaetz or you must vote for Pete Hegseth or something like that. They're kind of happening in parallel, but they're also all connected.
Okay, yeah, but in those cases, Matt Gaetz and Pete, these would be the opportunities of a lifetime. If you're Scott Bessent, if you're Mark Rowan, you are already worth borderline $1 gazillion. Sure. You might not actually, you want the power, but you might not want the headache, which is why, guys like Kevin Warsh, whose names have been thrown around, many people say he doesn't want to be Treasury Secretary. He wants to be Fed chair. They want the power, but they don't actually want to be tied to Trump, where he has much more control of you, and he doesn't in the case of the Fed chair. Carol, what do you think? Do you think he just needs whomever is going to go the farthest on his tariff plan? Because, yes, Trump wants a guy he can control, but Donald Trump does not want the economy, and specifically the stock market, to go sideways or down.
And I think actually, Steph, on this panel, you're the most well-versed in this entire topic, and you could run this show all by yourself. But I would say, don't count out Donald Trump's desire for drama and not being able to figure out until a little later that his choice wasn't the best. I mean, let's remember how many chiefs of staff he had. Let's remember how many Pentagon secretaries he had. Let's remember how many press secretaries he had. He changes his mind a lot. And I don't necessarily think that in this first move, he is thinking to himself the entire time, oh, I have a brilliant choice who is going to be perfect for the economy. He may think that, but whether or not that's reality is another matter.
Well, I think he really likes really big, powerful, successful guys heading on down to Mar-a-Lago and kissing his ring. I mean, chances are they never even wanted to go to Mar-a-Lago, and now they're dying to join. Let's talk about Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General. Mark, you just mentioned him. The House Ethics Committee is meeting on Wednesday to decide what they're going to do with this report on the investigation into him. I know what I think. How important do you think it is for the American people to see what's in this report?
Oh, I think it's hugely important. I think most senators would agree with this, although they are just walking on such eggshells around Trump. And that's part of the bigger discussion about, really these big four nominations that are quite controversial. If you consider Gaetz, Hegseth, Kennedy, maybe Tulsi Gabbard would be the four. I mean, the question is, will there be a bunch of senators who lock arms and basically say, we want to we don't want any of these people. I mean, it would be quite a bold step. And I think in general, you sort of have to assume that Republicans, when confronted with Donald Trump in this day and age, will bow to him, because that's been the precedent. But I think, Gaetz is really the tip of the spear here, because we're going to see, or we're not going to see, this ethics report come out. It's obviously radioactive, I think, the stuff in there, and I don't think they want it to go out.
Remember when people couldn't get confirmed because it was unclear if they paid their nannies' taxes? Leanne, the New York Times is reporting that Donald Trump is also standing by his man, Pete Hegseth, for defense secretary. Hegseth was accused of sexual assault back in 2017. He denies it, but he did reach a financial settlement with his accuser. What are you hearing from Senate Republicans on both Hegseth and Gaetz?
Yeah, so there's an interesting dynamic happening on Capitol Hill right now. Senate Republicans, as Mark mentioned, are very afraid of going against Donald Trump. And the full pressure campaign from Donald Trump and his allies haven't yet started. But I will say that Matt Gaetz is individually, he's calling senators and asking them if he's going to get a fair shake in his confirmation hearings. I also have reporting that Donald Trump and people close to Trump are also calling senators. Instead of pressuring at this point, they're asking questions. They're inquiring if the nominees are able to make it through the Senate. And so I think that there is a little bit of an assessment happening now, but I don't expect Donald Trump to back down. He's likely to stand by his people. As far as senators are concerned, I've seen a major shift over the past week since these nominees have been mentioned. At first, there was shock, and then there was mini outrage. And now, as these senators are having these conversations with Trump transition, with sometimes Trump, with the nominees themselves, they seem a lot more open to allowing this, at least the process, move forward. For example, there were calls last week by Republican senators for this ethics investigation or for this ethics report to be released. Now, just tonight, talking to Republican senators, including John Cornyn, Tom Tillis, who are saying, wait, we might not need this ethics report after all. The committee is going to do a complete investigation. And so we're seeing a lot of backsliding from Republicans, and it's proof that it's going to be really difficult for these Republicans to go against the president.